Hi. Hope everybody can see me and hear me. Many congratulations, Ian. Absolutely incredible.
Lord Best, I'm going to ask you, we need to just check your microphone. Can you get a bit closer to your...
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, better. I'm going to ask the tech crew people who are monitoring this to be sure that we continue properly. In other words, I will mute myself. If there is a problem, they will speak to you directly, but otherwise we assume that you're being heard correctly.
This is, I'm fulfilling the stereotype here that 75-year-olds can't cope with the digital technology. So apologies for that. And I'm hoping you can hear me. And I was congratulating Ian on his indefatigable approach to the issue. I'm saying that I've been thinking about the ISO standard approach to raising people's performance, improving standards. And this is, I think, it's a great opportunity. I hadn't thought this one through before. This, I think, could really work. This is an incredibly important way in to raising standards, to achieving things that at the moment we're not achieving. And let me just have a go at why I think the whole ISO approach, having universal international standards, a certificate, a kind of mark, why this could really make a difference. My background, my interest is chairing the all-party parliamentary group in Westminster on housing and care for older people. And in that context, we try desperately to raise the profile of how important housing is, integrated with social care and health, how housing can prevent the need for care, keep people out of hospital, prevent accidents and falls, get people out of hospital quickly because the home will receive you well, ensure against loneliness, enable you to contribute to your community as an active citizen. All the things that people need and want in older age, housing plays this key role. And we believe also that downsizing is a way of trying to reduce the inequalities between generations when we have so much under-occupation by older people in the UK and overcrowding. People in this COVID time, ghastly thought that you have to bring up your family and stay indoors in one room. We have terrible problems of overcrowding for younger generations while older people are occupying an awful lot of extra space. So downsizing, moving somewhere that will really suit you and see you through to your 100th birthday, this is really important stuff. But we're not winning. We're not achieving the production of multi-generational living. The house builders will build 1,500, 2,000 new homes on the edge of town, and they won't include a single space that is purpose-built, that is age-friendly, that's going to be suitable for people to live in into older age, is care-ready. They won't include that because that doesn't make money. That's not that the sums don't add up. Older people are a less attractive market than those young families who are desperate to move in and won't be too fussy. We're only building 7,000 specialist, purpose-built, tailor-made homes for older people every year, and the numbers of older people who are passing through into a retirement, this doesn't match at all. How can we change that? I think trust in the opportunities to downsize, to move, to start something new and special and important in your life, that trust is what is lacking in the UK. We've had fingers burnt by different ways in which the providers of accommodation, of financial support, of new systems have failed us. We've been let down by the providers in the past. And an ISO standard, a series of ISO standards that cover design, management, not least of leasehold property, and the financing systems, these could make a massive difference. So I think an ISO standard could bridge this gap of trust that is holding back the opportunities that clearly exist for a massive growth in the numbers of homes being produced by those enlightened, but I'm afraid not major house builders and providers in the UK. We could see an ISO standard that protects the consumer, that guides the regulator, that supports lenders in deciding where the money should go, their money should go, the grant makers, government, local government, all decisions on what you support requires you to understand what is good practice, what are the decent standards that people should be aiming for in terms of design, in terms of property management, of management of a community, in terms of financial conduct. This is where I think an ISO standard or series of standards could get us through this, get us to that tipping point where it becomes, as in other countries, a common practice in the UK for you to think about downsizing, think about moving to a new home where you will be better served and where you can release your family house for others. Now, I'm afraid COVID, I believe, has set us back. It has, of course, in so many ways, but it has set us back in terms of people's perceptions of older life living. It has become, I hear so many of my friends saying, thank goodness for our garden. It's given us exercise, it's given us fresh air, it's given us space. Thank goodness for the spare rooms in our house. Thank goodness for the shed outside. Those of us preaching downsizing to more high density living, to places on the high street rather than out in the country, I think COVID has set us back, but we can regroup. And if we can build trust, this is a worthwhile move in later, that will make an enormous difference to the housing of the UK. And that trust, I think, would be hugely enhanced if there were universally accepted, properly agreed standards which the ISO model can provide for us. So good on you, Ian, and good on all of those amongst you who are working on this important new theme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Much appreciated and absolutely spot on. When I was asked initially to think about this, like you, the question was, how can a standard really make a difference? And I've learnt, because I've spent quite a lot of time with Nell over the past few months, I've learnt to understand that in reality, we're talking, as you suggested, about multiple standards that need to sit within a framework, which in turn, and that framework being an aging society's framework, which in turn can be ruled by a single multi-generational neighbourhood standard. So it's standards within standards which define best practice, but in order to get to that point, consultation is critical so that we actually hear what's going on around the world. And so therefore, it's not a matter of imposing a solution, it's a matter of creating a consensus. And I think that that's really very interesting and a worthwhile thing to do. We're going to come back to Q&As after we've heard from John Godfrey, who is the Director of Public Affairs at Legal & General. I do believe that John is also located in the country somewhere, so we are also battling against broadband restrictions for people who are responding outside of the capital cities. So, John, can we see you?
I hope so. My video is on, and I hope I'm unmuted. So
We can definitely hear you. I can see the top of your head, so I'm going to take myself out of the frame. There you go. So over to you, sir.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Ian, for inviting me along to this, and thanks also to ISO and NatWest. I'm always a little nervous following Lord Best because his expertise in this field is absolutely unparalleled. But let me just start with who is Legal & General. We are the UK's largest institutional investor. We're also a house builder and a pension provider. And we took a decision.
Can I just ask you just move fractionally back from the camera, because we can only see the top half of your head, at least I can on my monitor. There we are.
That's
great, thank you. Yes.
Okay. So about a decade ago, we took a decision that we had a number of strategic growth drivers, and one of them was the aging demographic, which of course pointed us very naturally in the direction of thinking about housing for older people and multi-generational housing. And just to pick up on one of your kind of exam questions for this, it is absolutely our conclusion that there is a ready-made market here for people to play into, but it is undoubtedly an ill-served market at the moment. It's not properly understood. And when it comes down to housing, at least in the UK, we are housing obsessed, but we seem to know the price of everything and not necessarily the value. So I just want to tackle those issues in order, if you like. The first thing, the size of the market. Well, there's been a vast amount of work, and very good work, on what is called the economics of the third age. And what it shows you is that A, the boomer and the older population is growing, both absolutely and in relative terms. And B, it is that part of the population that has the most disposable income. So, those who want to verify that, go and have a look at Oxford Economics and the longevity economy. The AARP in the States has reached the same conclusion and says that if retirees were a country, they would be the third largest economy in the world. So the market potentially exists for this to be a growth segment. If you then zero in a little bit on housing, we see in the UK that those of pensionable age own around £1.5 trillion worth of housing equity. Now, of course, not everybody who is above retirement age is loaded up with housing value. And we need to think, as Lord Best has done in other contexts, about those who still face pensioner poverty and those who are renters, and what are they going to do going forward. But I want to focus, first of all, on the size of the economic pot, if you like, that exists there. For many people, housing has been the result of a lifetime's accumulation. It's where they've locked up a lifetime's worth of saving, and it's not terribly rationally used always. Housing is not the same as any other asset, of course, both in people's minds and in terms of the way it's treated for tax, for assessment for liability for care means tests, and so on. So it is a slightly different category. Now, it's not a very well understood market, the older consumer market, if you like. Marketing people in all sectors of the economy don't analyze it closely enough. They don't segment it closely enough. And frankly, they're more interested in chasing after the millennial dollar than they are in looking at the spending power of the older part of the population. Too often we see populations and consumer populations segmented into a dozen groups or so, and then the last group is, and there's the over 60s. Now, somebody of 65 is not the same as somebody of 95. Very different needs. So there needs to be much better understanding. In housing terms, we still exist too much in a sort of binary world where people live in the family home, they continue to stay there, and then suddenly they have to go into a care home. This is completely unsatisfactory, and I think the COVID crisis has shown us, even more than we knew already, how unsatisfactory this is. We need to be prolonging independent living for longer, self-sufficiency for longer, a gradual increase in the use of care rather than this all-or-nothing approach. The choice that we face as older consumers is completely insufficient. There is a shortage of supply of appropriate housing, as Richard Best has highlighted, and there is a shortage of choice. By choice, what I mean is that we need more for all forms of tenure, that is, to own, to rent, socially unaffordable housing, and so on. We need a choice of location. Most people don't want to downsize or right-size very far from where they live. We need solutions for those who want to stay in their own home and retrofit it or adapt it for longer independent living. And of course, we need choices between multi-generational communities and retirement villages, which are popular. We operate quite a number of them, and we've just secured planning consents for another 4 during the lockdown period. The community piece is hugely important. And so this is not just about creating ghettos or blocks. This is about creating environments where people can live and thrive independently. Malcolm Johnson's work on the 4-year-old care home has been mentioned a lot, but he is a terrific advocate of the way that we design communities for later living. So let's just think about the difference between knowing the price of everything and the value of everything. And I just want to highlight 3 different areas of housing value that we should be thinking about. There is a health value in having the right housing. We don't think often enough about the communal gain that can be achieved through the right housing. And we see it in our retirement villages through reduced GP call-outs, reduced ambulance call-outs, reduced visits to accident and emergency in hospital, and reduced hospital stays. So if we're going to think more optimistically about the 100-year life, for example, that is a form of value that we should be thinking very hard about. This is part of quality of life, of course, as well as economics. People don't want to live longer necessarily if they're living in pain and in a high dependency, unhappy sort of life. We need to think then about the well-being value. Slightly different from health, but this is about mental health. It is about staying active and preventing cognitive decline. And it's about independence and dignity. That must be absolutely at the core of everything we do. So these things need to be factored in as a form of value. And we need to think about the broader economic value. You know, 1 unit of housing equity in a family home could support several homes. 1 4-bedroom house is no good to you if you are asset rich but income poor. You can't maintain it. It's unsafe, it's unhealthy, it is deteriorating, and it's needed by growing families. It's been alluded to already. This is locked up value that can be better used. The solution, very broadly, is much more supply across all categories of housing, much more choice and local choice, changes to planning to make that happen, and of course, standards, which brings us back to the core point around this conference. We've had fantastic examples from around the globe. There are fantastic examples in the UK too. I like to think that Inspired Villages sets a standard in terms of our own business as well. So these are terrific. I would strongly urge development of these ISO standards and a collaboration to achieve that. And I would stress also the importance of engaging academics in that. One of our aging population and demographic as a growth driver outcomes is that we're investing £20 million with the University of Edinburgh to explore what later life care and later life housing should look like. It's a 7-year research program. I hope that lots of those, and we've had other examples from around the globe, from Italy and from Norway and from everywhere else. I hope this conference brings people together to develop exactly the kind of framework that we need to make this really happen, because this is not only a huge growth opportunity for housing companies, for investors, but it's also a great opportunity for people who are going to live longer and should be enabled to live longer, more independently and more happily. So I'll stop there, Ian, and hopefully we'll have some interesting questions.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, we'll have the questions after. I do have one very quick question for you, which is I've been thinking about. I know that strategically, L&G focused on retirement. It's a big, big play. Nobody anticipated what's happening now. At an institutional level, do you still feel, not specific to your business, but across the board, that the kind of ambition that you had in terms of designing new forms of retirement communities, multi-generational communities, is sustainable, i.e. is the money there to make the investment as anticipated previously?
Yes, absolutely, Ian. And I think, in fact, what we're going to see is a reinforcement of that strategy as a result of COVID. Because we will see, I believe, some difficult times coming for the traditional elderly care industry, and we will see an accelerated adaptation of how we cope as a country with accommodation for an aging population. Even though the death count, sadly, has been high through COVID, it doesn't change the underlying fact that we have an aging demographic.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that shortly. I'm going to switch to Filippo Attari, who's in Spain, I believe. He's the founding partner and CEO of Plus Value. No, it is Italy, and Filippo's company is engaged in social impact and is particularly interested in the Milan project, which Alberto was talking about a little earlier. So without further ado, Filippo, as I said, please be as provocative as you like. Over to you.
Hi, Ian. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you very well. I can't see you at all, but there you are.
Perfect. So actually, rectification. I'm actually based in London, but I will talk about Milan. In particular, in the time allocated to me, I'd like to cover the role of housing, its strategic role within a multi-generational community devoted to science and innovation, and how to enhance it in its full potential. Now, I will talk in particular not about the project mentioned by Alberto, which is the San Raffaele, but another innovation district, which is MIND, Milan Innovation District. It's the legacy project of Expo 2015 that some of you, I'm sure, visited. We are talking about a brand new innovation district, 100 hectares, 2 billion investment for a 99 years project that will bring together top research centers, universities, hospitals, and business dedicated to explore and develop the new frontiers of life sciences and the services for the city of the future. Now, I've been with my company, Plus Value, has been involved in this, working with Lend-Lease, the international urban regeneration company. So it's a multi-billion business operating from New York, London, Sydney, and working with them in developing the innovation ecosystem. So if you want everything which is not the real estate part, but the software of what makes an innovation district. And we are talking about a brand new community of 60,000 people dedicated to research, education, and innovation. Now, why housing is so important? Housing is, first of all, the social infrastructure for a site like this one, because it has to provide housing for everybody, a variety of people across generations. If you think that in the innovation community, age is never an obstacle. Actually, diversity is what makes an innovation community successful. And people who are dedicated to science, research, innovation are not there for the money. So housing has to be affordable in order for the innovation community to deliver. It has to attract and retain talents. You mustn't segregate people. But it's not just housing a social infrastructure, is also a transformative infrastructure. So if we stop thinking about housing as buildings, and we start thinking housing as a physical dimension of co-living, then you realize that housing is just not a necessity, but it's vital for that innovation community that needs to mingle, connect, work together in every moment of their life. So housing become that transformative infrastructure for the innovation community to deliver on their potential, and that becomes also an economic dimension. Therefore, to do so and not to leave it to the luck, we have established an impact investing fund. So a fund that does not seek only the financial returns, but also the positive social impact that, that sharing, quality of life, that attract and retains talents. Because remember, there is a fierce competition across the world to attract those people, from the students to the professors to the medical personnel who make the value of that community. And in particular, we will also invest in a housing service dedicated to the medical service. And clearly, this has come up as a necessity due to COVID, and we are very proud of it. Now, this sounds all beautiful and positive, but when you mix capital and impact, you have to also deal with what I would call the free rider capital. So the fact that will be investors that would take the advantage of the fact that impact attracts resources and opportunities. So it's not just about capital availability, also standards, and having international standards that guarantee that quality of life, that the impact side of housing is fundamental. And so your work with the ISO standards from our point of view becomes fundamental. So in the let's say in a startup phase, we needed the room to explore the boundaries of the impact dimension. But as we move into really mainstream core social infrastructures as housing. We need international standards, and I believe that a solution could come from the ISO standards you are developing with the network. So we are really keen on the outcome of this exercise.
Thank you very much, Filippo. That was quite insightful in respect of the socio-economic benefit of finance in this space. I just want to comment briefly on some commentary that's going on in relation to people who are perhaps arriving without the broader context and wondering why we're not talking about technology as a priority at this particular stage. Two things. One, from an ISO perspective, they have, as we heard from the beginning, so many different standards, some of which are already developed, that we are in their hands in terms of what the priority is. The point is that technology becomes a critical consideration within this particular standard, and we will address it a little bit later on. Similarly, other areas, I mean, actually, it's a huge can of worms, if the truth be told. But equally, every area that we're looking at has so much depth to it. So from a finance point of view, we're looking at institutional investment. We're looking at the public agenda from Lord Best. We're looking now at social impact. And Xavier Rudex-Kroon from the Grosvenor Group, they have a particular interest in multi-generational neighbourhoods. They are a huge landlord both in the UK and around the world, and so they need to see sustainable value. And the reason I engaged with them, and there's quite a significant chapter within our Neighbourhoods of the Future report on what they're doing, is because they recognised how important age-friendly environments are, but also environments that address the whole multi-generational issue. So hopefully Xavier is here somewhere, presumably in the UK. Xavier, could you say hello?
Hi, I'm going to try to put that camera on. I should be, yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me properly. As Ian was saying, so Grosvenor is one of the world's largest privately owned property business. So we develop, manage and invest in property in more than 66 cities around the world. And we have a presence in the UK, we have a presence in the Americas, in Asia, and also in Europe. Our purpose really is to improve properties and places to deliver lasting commercial and social benefits. And we do that by adopting a far-sighted approach, being locally engaged and sharing and benefiting from our international experience. And we call that our Living Cities approach. So basically in Grosvenor, cooperation and learning from each other really matters for what we do. And we try to encourage that innovation cross-border where we have successfully developed elsewhere. I think these three elements of delivering social benefits, having a very far-sighted approach, and learning from each other make our proposition quite unique in itself. And that proposition is very much common sense, if you think about it, is providing places for people to want to live, work and play. And to do this, we need to be able to meet, first of all, the customer requirements, but above and beyond that, we need to be able to meet their aspirations. And we also need to, for those customers, to trust what we're delivering and what we promise on delivering. And I very much echo Lord's best saying in that, is that trust is so important, and it's something that unfortunately we're missing in the UK on the developer side. And I really believe this is where the ISO framework would help, and it will help in several ways. First of all, the standard could help bring a shared vision for place and remove one potential barrier for development that we're facing a lot of times, and it's around the need to educate our customers and the need to educate our stakeholders. Standardization could also guarantee the type of product we deliver for our customers, and in that it will improve trust in developers. Standardization could also help speed up the planning process and therefore accelerate the delivery of suitable housing, at least in the UK. And in turn, this will help on the cost side. And viability is as much an issue for developers as today is affordability for our customers. And by helping on the planning side, we could bring also smaller players to the market to work together on the shared vision for place. Finally, I think standardization could encourage innovation and proper planning for the future of our communities. And as you said, communities is very important for Grosvenor because we really strive to make a difference in the communities where we operate. And these communities, to be able to deliver a place for these communities, demands a vision that is really rooted in that community history and needs, and that means very strong engagement on the company side, and also working in complete transparency with the communities. And it's very much in that context that I believe the standard to lay out an overarching framework of that vision to create places that appeal to a mix of people and generations. I mean, good design, that means adaptable and flexible solutions for everyone. Overall, this ISO standard, by increasing transparency, could mean we trust each other a lot more, and through that trust we can help on the housing side, because we'll make it easier for the public to weigh the value and the cost of each other development coming to the market. And that trust will also be improved by the fact that we increase transparency by enabling scrutiny from an independent commentator, and we're promoting that openness and that dialogue. And by making it easier, by enabling scrutiny and by promoting openness, I think these are three of the byproducts I would really like to see coming out of this ISO standardization work. And finally, on the ISO standards, I think it would allow us better to respond to a market that is getting more sophisticated, because we have an increased need for more tenures, different tenures to be available. And we also need to get more investors into that market. We heard it before. Finance and the ability to finance all this housing is as important as the delivery in itself. And to go back to the planning level, I think to increase the level of comprehension around multi-generational and affordable housing is very important. And as I said earlier, it's just the market is still very fragmented, and we need to be able to bring together all the operators that have each their little niche, so we are able to work together and create a healthy mix of houses. And if we can do that, I think communities will put themselves together organically. Yeah, well, that's pretty much what I had to say in a nutshell.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I just have a question for you. When you talk about the import for openness, you're a private institutional company and an investor. What role does openness play in that context?
I think openness is again a question of trust. So if we have a policy of getting engaged with our communities very early on, to be able to make sure we have first the understanding of the community, which what we're trying to achieve in their midst, but also make sure that we respond to their needs and to their aspirations. And that openness is critical in that sense. And I think openness is critical with the local authorities as well, because they need to understand how we operate. And let's be frank about it, we're developers, we don't do things just for the goodness of our hearts. We still need to make a profit, even if it's not a big one. But we still need to be able to make that profit to be able to carry on developing places for people. So being open about that as well, and being completely honest about how we go about things, opening our books and saying, well, this is how we calculated things. The notion of affordability is very relative. What works in London or wouldn't work in Manchester, and vice versa, or somewhere in France or Italy. So I think we have to be very open about the way we do business and the cost and value of development out there.
So the question I asked John earlier in relation to the pandemic and the impact on finance around the world, how do you anticipate that will impact your business and your plans for the future? Have you had the opportunity to take stock as yet?
Well, we're lucky in the sense that we've been around for a long time and we've got good relationships with our banks and all that. And we have good relationships with most of the investors we've worked with in the past. So it hasn't been a problem so far for us. But we do recognize that there is a need to get more money into that market, and not just the later living side, but the whole market. Because at the moment we cater very well, reasonably well, for the two ends of the market. So the very low end where you've got social housing, and the very high end where you've got very prime development. But there's very little in the mid-market. And this is where we need to get the finance in. And for that, there needs to be a better understanding of what's going on and what we need to provide. In terms of will the finance go back to the market? Yes. Definitely. Just because you think about all the money that is in the system at the moment, and with what the central banks have put together, that money will have to go somewhere anyway. And looking at housing has been, and housing and property has always been a kind of place of choice for long-term, far-sighted investment. And I think more people are going to come back to that patient capital view, that we need to be there for the long time.
Okay, so the questions relating to finance, consolidated, most people want to know the same thing, which is, given that the four of you are already on the same page in terms of the import of inclusivity, the value of multi-generational and age-friendly housing. The question is, how can we spur innovation at the scale that is needed? And I'd like to ask each of you that, not exclusively for your own companies or your own interests, but across the board. What kind of catalysts, bearing in mind the current state of affairs, what kind of catalyst should we be looking for? And how indeed could this standard play a part in that? So if I could see a hand, I'm not seeing, I can see Lord Best. So if we can go to Lord Best and hear him, that'd be fabulous.
Yeah. First of all, will the money keep flowing? Will there be the money to invest? I think we're going to see a lot of institutional investors no longer wanting to put money into office developments, because people are going to do more working from home. That's going to change. Less money going into retail, because shops, I'm afraid, because everyone's going online, not so much requirement there. So in the property world, if you want something that is really safe and long-term in property, it's going to be housing. It's going to be people's homes. And so attracting that money, how to do it, it's going to require in the UK some sticks and carrots. And I think the people who wield the sticks, planners, central government, regulators, even ombudsmen, they need that ISO standard against which to judge whether or not their actions are justified, whether it is whether they are right to insist on X and Y, on transparency, on integrity, on whichever aspect of it that they're controlling. And as far as carrots go, there are lots of carrots. We can be helpful to developers, or we can be unhelpful. We can give tax relief for things. We can drop stamp duty for pensioners buying who are downsizing, give them an unfair advantage, but a very important advantage that might entice them to downsize, to move, because of the good things that flow from that. In judging whether to use a stick and whether to give a carrot, I think the ISO standard standards, that's going to be really helpful.
Fantastic, very encouraging. I can see John's head there, so can I ask you to come in?
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree, actually, with what Richard Best has just been saying. And I think we're going to talk about some policy aspects later on today. The bit that two things I would sort of throw into this conversation about what are the catalysts for change. The first one is collaboration across technology and research, and I'm incredibly encouraged by what I heard about what was happening in Milan with Lend-Lease and the academic establishment, if you like. There, we're trying to do the same thing in Edinburgh. I think more of that will create more and more confidence and produce better and better products. The second point, I think, is that pandemics in the past, or epidemics, have served really to accelerate existing trends. And one of those trends, I think, will be a move towards less institutional care and more care for older people in the home. The more we can create confidence around that, and that means using much more technology, the better. I think these things will encourage people to want more of the right sort of housing. And if they want more of the right sort of housing, the market hopefully will supply it at the right price.
Excellent, thank you. Can I ask Alexander, you've got a hand up to come in.
Yeah, obviously there is this financial aspect that's been mentioned that you cannot go around. An investor for long term needs to make returns. And specifically in the situation that we are today, is that we should not only rely on subsidies, because on the long term that is not sustainable. Now, we've clearly identified over the years activities, operations that can create much value around the habitat or real estate. But at the end of the day, what is the value? People are happy, and how do you see that is obviously by the length of stay that they have, but also more and that's obviously the core element for the investor. Obviously, my level of vacancy is highest. I don't have the lowest. I don't have any vacancy. The occupation is right. But also, how do I put value? And value is related to operations. And operations is activities, interactions that you have with your neighbors, mainly with your families as well. How do I allow family members to link to their elderly in the habitat, between the neighbors, the activities in the buildings, but also how do we create additional value? For instance, cultural heritage. Today, we've just mentioned today about how can we put back value for the elderly people, is that they have a very big role to play in the cultural heritage, family values, past jobs, how society is built, history telling. Those are really aspects that should be incorporated into the operations. And then on top of that, when you design the real estate, where obviously from the moment you do that, you need to think about very long-term review, is that it needs to be designed. What we tend to do is we build, and then after we start thinking about what we should do in that. No, that's not our approach. We should do it the opposite around and start with the needs and the opportunities and then build.
Okay, thank you for that. Rather than extend that particular question, I do have one burning question. which I think I'll put to John in the first instance, which is, this is all very well and good, and it's fantastic because to some degree we're preaching to the converted, and that includes probably most of the people in the room, which is great. But when I have conversations with developers, they're saying, we want to spend X because our margin is Y. Therefore, how can we afford to do what you're talking about? And yes, you can afford legal and general to make a big play and to build factories and to look at modern methods of construction and to bite the bullet until that becomes a reality. But how many developers can do this? So in other words, the question really is, how can we get that critical mass that will make a difference? Because whilst you can catalyze your approach, how do we actually go beyond that with the big builders who, I won't let Lord Best answer that because it won't be complimentary, but he has, as we know, very clear views. How can we get the usual suspects to be different in this approach?
Well, I think how you approach this, if you're in that business, depends to some extent on what your balance sheet looks like and what your time profile is for achieving returns, and so on. And, it is undoubtedly true that parts of the house building industry operate a sort of build 12, sell 12 mentality, and that the standard sort of 3-bed family home is the easiest way to work that balance sheet. My thought in terms of how you get greater expansion of the sort of building we're talking about here is that we need to create many opportunities for the right sorts of project, and then you involve not just institutional long-term money like ours, but you also involve a whole ecology, if you like, of people who are involved in delivering that product. So this is, if you like, a sort of longer supply chain. It's not that one operator needs to be the developer, the landowner, the eventual owner of the properties, the person who sells the properties, and every step of the way. But you need to bring together a sort of coalition. I mean, we do this from our own examples in partnerships in places like Newcastle, in Leeds, and so on, in Cardiff, with local developers and builders who are very happy to get on board if the right underpin is there. So I think we need more of that kind of partnership approach rather than simply relying on, if you like, your standard UK house building model to deliver. But it's certainly doable, in my opinion.
Thank you. Let me bring in Filippo, because I would like to see an international context. Obviously, you've got the other dimension that you're talking about, social impact. So you're coming at it through a specific lens, but you've got your hand up. So what's your point on this one, please?
That we address this very specific point, exploring a new financial model in the project financing for the new hospital of Treviso. So essentially putting a price on positive social impact. And that had a double effect. Number one, essentially it gave access to cheaper capital. There are investors ready to essentially lower their financial expectations in order to achieve positive social impact. What's the largest one in Europe? The European Investment Bank. And the European Investment Bank, for instance, it's the financial institutions that provided capital to make the project in Treviso a success. But on the other hand, it's also on the demand side. So to invest in impact, to make those places the most attractive. The challenge for traditional real estate companies is to understand what attractiveness means today to people. Because what we are experiencing is a fundamental change of values. So it's not the big, shiny, luxurious apartment that people might want these days, but it's different kind of forms of livings which are less reflected in the material aspects of life, because it's about the quality of life, it's about the balance with nature, the life and work balance. And this cultural challenge, it's what I find a real challenge for real estate developers.
Thanks very much. Actually, Nell's got a great question, but on the other hand, she's also reminding me that we are running behind and to move on. So we will save that good question that you just sent to me for a little bit later. I think you'll find another place for it. Also, I'd like to point out that you should all have received an email with a link to a questionnaire that we've got, so that we have an opportunity for your voices to be heard. We'd like you to fill that in. If you complete it, we will end up sending you some kind of summary of this event. We will send it out again a little later. I'd like to thank all of the contributors to that last session, because we have been very fortunate with the caliber of contributors, and I would ask you to join me in applauding, but clearly that doesn't work, so we could do the kind of wave hand thingy if we wanted to, but apart from that, feel yourselves thanked, and please stay with us.